In 2004, a quiet university student was found brutally murdered in her family's Gwangju apartment, South Korea. Bound with tape and left with only a few small belongings missing, her death shocked the community and left investigators baffled. With no clear motive, no obvious suspects, and few clues at the scene, the case soon grew cold. Yet years later, with new forensic techniques emerging, could the mystery behind this horrifying crime finally be solved? Today, let's talk about the Gwangju tape murder case. On the morning of September 14th, 2004, police were called to an apartment complex in Yongbong-dong, Bukgu, Gwangju South Jeolla Province. There wasn't any immediate chaos when they arrived, but as they made their way to the 13th floor, the air grew heavy. Something was clearly wrong. At the entrance to the apartment, they spotted a half-open bag lying near the door. It looked as though someone had been in the middle of getting ready to leave. But what stood out more was a trail of blood starting in the living room and leading toward a smaller room nearby. The officers followed the trail, and what they found inside was grim. Isona, a pseudonym for the 22-year-old university student, lay dead in her family's apartment. Her face and hands were tightly wrapped in yellow packing tape, suffocating her. The sight was disturbing, made worse by the clear signs of a struggle. The blood stains throughout the living room suggested that Sona had been attacked there before she was dragged into the smaller room where her body was found. What made the crime particularly unsettling wasn't just the violence, but the methodical way the tape had been applied. The killer had taken the time to wrap it tightly around her entire face and head, ensuring she couldn't breathe. Her arms had been tied behind her back with a scarf and then bound again with more tape. Despite the fact that her lower body was exposed, she was still dressed in her outer clothes and socks, suggesting she may have been interrupted while preparing to leave the apartment. Sona wasn't someone anyone would expect to be the target of such a horrific crime. She was an ordinary university student with aspirations of becoming an art teacher. She had no known enemies, which made the murder even more puzzling. Sona had been struck on the head at least 7 times. Her right cheek was deeply bruised, leading investigators to believe the killer had used their bare hands in the assault. The focus on her head and the severity of the blows suggested the killer had acted in a fit of rage, perhaps panicking in the moment and repeatedly lashing out. The careful use of the tape, combined with the chaotic violence, raised questions for the investigators. Why would the killer take the time to bind her so methodically, but then attack her with such force? Sona's official cause of death was asphyxiation. Her nose and mouth had been completely sealed with tape. It's a horrifying way to die, but the method was strangely deliberate. The killer took time to carefully wrap her face with layers of tape, 22 meters in length, making it clear this wasn't just a quick act of violence. Why use so much tape? On the morning of the murder, her mother had prepared a lunchbox for her daughter and left 13,000 won on the table for transportation before heading to a club event. Her father had left earlier, around 7:40 a.m., never knowing it would be the last time he'd see his daughter alive. Sona's mother followed around 8:55 a.m., placing the money and lunchbox on the table. When her mother returned later that night at 8:20 p.m., the apartment was far from normal. What had once been a safe and familiar home was now a crime scene. The apartment had been searched, but strangely, there were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, and no DNA left behind by the killer. The door had a number lock and security camera, so how had the attacker gotten inside? Bloodstains near the intercom and throughout the living room told the story of a struggle, which appeared to have grown more intense as it moved towards Seona's room. Investigators thought the killer might have seized the moment when Seona was preparing to leave and attacked her by surprise. But how did the killer know she was alone at home? Some details didn't fit with this theory. The killer took the 13,000 won on the table and Seona's phone, but leave behind more valuable items like her digital camera. Investigators believe the killer took the phone to avoid being traced. Removing the phone could prevent investigators from tracking her calls or contacts, perhaps making them think the crime wouldn't be connected back to the killer. A neighbor on the floor below heard loud thumping noises, like something heavy was hitting the floor while they were watching a drama. This detail helped narrow down the time of the crime to sometime between 9:30 and 11:30 a.m. As police pieced the timeline together, they realized the killer may have stayed in the apartment for much longer than initially thought. Although it seemed reckless, Seona's phone had been turned on twice after the crime, near a base station in Dongseongdong, about a 15-minute drive from the scene. The phone signal was detected at 12:10 p.m. and again at 12:49 p.m. With the travel time in mind, this suggested that the killer might have stayed in the apartment until nearly noon. Piecing everything together, the neighbor's account, the phone signals, and the travel time, it became clear that the killer had spent over 2 hours at the scene. But why stay so long after committing such a violent crime? This led investigators to consider the possibility that the killer knew Seona. When a killer is familiar with a victim, they often cover the victim's face as a way of distancing themselves from the crime. However, in this case, the killer didn't just cover her face. They used excessive amounts of tape, wrapping it tightly around her head and arms. This level of overkill suggested not only familiarity, but possibly a personal grudge or deep anger. The police began by examining Seona's life. Was there anyone who might have had the reason to harm her? But nothing pointed in that direction. She was well liked by her classmates and teachers, and no one knew of any enemies or conflicts. This led investigators to shift their focus to her parents. Could the crime have been a result of someone holding a grudge against her family? The investigation dug deep, even exploring potential grudges related to her grandparents. Yet every lead turned up empty. Seona's family was well respected, and there were no known conflicts that could have led to such a brutal crime. Then, the use of tape in the murder became a focal point. The police looked into other cases where tape had been used, and they found that in many of those instances, the killer knew the victim. In most of those cases, the tape was brought to the scene, signaling premeditation. But Seona's case was different. The tape appeared to have been taken from her own home, indicating that the killer may not have planned to use it initially. Experts began to wonder, was this a crime committed by someone Seona knew, or was it more spontaneous? It seemed possible that the killer hadn't planned the crime in advance and simply used the tape because it was available. The crime could have been impulsive, driven by panic and fear. Then a new lead surfaced. A neighbor from 2 floors above Seona's apartment came forward, reporting that they had seen a man in his 20s holding a newspaper heading downstairs around 10:30 a.m. While the description was vague, it introduced another potential suspect into the investigation. Things grew even more complicated when another witness mentioned seeing 2 men with short hair near the staircase around the same time. This raised a new question. Was the crime committed by one person, or were there 2 accomplices involved? If there were 2 men involved in the crime, the level of violence used didn't seem to make sense. 2 people would have had no trouble overpowering Seona without resorting to such extreme brutality. But if the killer was acting alone, the excessive force might be explained by panic or desperation, struggling to subdue her without any help. One thing was clear: the initial blow had to have been severe, setting off a violent chain of events. Blood patterns at the scene suggested Sona had been struck repeatedly while still alive, and the angle of the blood splatter indicated she might have been kneeling or crouching low when the assault began. The bloodstains left behind revealed more crucial details. One investigator noted that if the victim had been bleeding continuously, there would have been more blood on the bed. This led them to believe that Sona had been restrained outside the bed at first, and was only brought to the bed later, where her face was taped. The taping, which caused her suffocation, seemed to be a deliberate way for the killer to silence her, preventing any screams. The quick, intense struggle suggested that while the violence was severe, it didn't last long. As I mentioned before, her phone was turned on twice, around 12:10 p.m. and 12:49 p.m., at a location about 15 minutes away from the apartment. Initially, this led police to believe that the killer had stayed at the crime scene for over 2 hours. And this is why the police believed the killer was someone the victim knew. If the killer hadn't known that her parents wouldn't return anytime soon, they likely would have fled the scene much earlier. The fact that the killer stayed for an extended period suggested a certain level of confidence in their knowledge of the household's schedule. However, when they discovered that Sona's computer had been turned off at 11:27 a.m., the timeline shifted. It became clear that the killer likely left the scene much sooner, possibly within 30 minutes of the crime. This made the attack seem even more purposeful and fast. And in the end, what did the killer take? Just 13,000 won, which is about $10, and Sona's phone. This raised the possibility that the motive was robbery, a quick crime, maybe to fund gambling or some other urgent need, although the fact that the killer left behind her digital camera is strange. The killer could have been a burglar targeting empty homes in the complex. But this didn't help the police track the suspect down. There were no fingerprints or DNA left at the scene, except for one crucial piece of evidence: the tape used to bind Sona. In 2016, the tape was reanalyzed, and this time, investigators found a clue: male DNA in the form of YSTR, a type of DNA passed down from father to son. While YSTR doesn't uniquely identify one person, it can narrow down suspects to male relatives within the same family. Through reanalysis, the National Forensic Service confirmed 19 out of 22 Y chromosome markers, providing information detailed enough to allow one-on-one comparison with potential suspects. However, despite this progress, no exact match has been found so far, leaving the investigation open. While it might seem like the investigation has hit a dead end, there's still hope, thanks to advances in forensic technology. One promising development is a method called DNA methylation, which can estimate a suspect's age by analyzing how their DNA changes over time. This technique has already been used successfully in other cases, helping investigators narrow down the suspect pool by providing an age estimate that's accurate within a few years. This evolving technology brings renewed hope for solving the Gwangju University student murder case. Sona's scarf and the 42 pieces of tape used to bind her still hold untapped potential for a breakthrough. As the years pass, the murder of Sona remains an unsolved tragedy, but advances in forensic science continue to provide hope that justice may one day be served. The investigators' relentless efforts to uncover the truth reflect their commitment to bringing closure to a case that has haunted both the community and Sona's loved ones. Our deepest condolences go out to her family and friends who have endured unimaginable pain. We stand with them in hoping that one day, the person responsible for this senseless crime will be held accountable, and that Sona's memory will finally receive the peace it deserves. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.